I am Lauren Swartz. I'm the president and CEO at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. It is a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. It's a pleasure to be back in person for the first time in a while for some of you and to see some familiar faces in the audience again. We have members of the World Affairs Council with us, members and patrons of the Philadelphia Orchestra and Kimmel Cultural Campus, and friends and guests. Thank you for spending about an hour with us tonight to talk about the state of the European Union. The World Affairs Council is an international affairs experience provider with 70 years of expertise in simply connecting Philadelphia to the world. We get to do that in partnership tonight with one of our leading cultural institutions. At the Council, we offer about 25 programs like this every year, bringing heads of state, presidents, authors, activists, and more to Philadelphia so you can ask them your questions to better understand the world around you. We also bring world affairs education to life in 85 middle and high schools across the region. We've educated 1 million young people so far, and we're working on our next million across Philadelphia. We offer professional development for adults so they can know whether to kiss, bow, or shake hands, or something in between when they're meeting people from other cultures and other countries. And we offer 30 international, immersive, and unique travel experiences around the world, all in service of making a more globally connected Philadelphia. As you can imagine, we talk a lot about diplomacy. And often that comes in the form of diplomats, which we have here with us tonight, delegations, defense, and the like. But the more interesting conversation about diplomacy has so many more tools in the toolbox. Soft diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, includes art, music, of course, education, people-to-people exchange, business, trade, and investment, and so much more. And it's almost like its own orchestra playing together when our country is trying to build relationships with another country to create prosperity, peace, business, trade, economic vitality. And this partnership tonight is just a moment of that broader diplomatic relationship. And we're here tonight talking about Europe because the orchestra is hitting the road again, traveling to Europe this fall. So our conversation tonight is a bit of a primer for that. Some of you in the audience are fortunate enough to be traveling with the orchestra in the fall. I was fortunate enough to do many orchestra tours around the world, making sure that the work we did alongside the orchestra created platforms for trade and investment, education, and people-to-people diplomacy. I can assure you that this does work. Tonight, we have 2 leading experts with us, and it'll be a relatively simple and straightforward program, so a bit of housekeeping. After my opening remarks, which will be over in just a moment, we'll have Matthias Tarnopolsky from the orchestra give some opening remarks and help frame the orchestra's role in diplomacy. Then I'll have a moderated discussion with our guests, followed by questions. These are your questions for our ambassadors that are here. When you have a question, raise your hand, and someone will bring a microphone to you so we can all hear you clearly. There's a digital program book on our website, wacphila.org, if you're interested in learning more or reviewing the biographies of our speakers. While we are still in the pandemic, it seems masks are optional but encouraged this evening. Now I'd like to introduce Matthias Tarnopolsky to you all. He's the president and CEO of the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Kimmel Cultural Campus. He's been here with us in Philadelphia since 2018. Definitely an international gem of the city, leading our orchestra and now the Kimmel Cultural Campus to new heights, creating audiences that are more diverse than ever. Previously, he studied in London and has degrees in classical music. He's also held leadership roles at the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and at Cal Performances at UC Berkeley, among many other things. Matthias, thank you for your partnership tonight, and I invite you to the podium.
Lauren, thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for the extraordinary partnership with you and your fantastic team. We're delighted to co-host tonight's program on the future of the European project. As a British citizen, that stings. And to be doing so in partnership with you and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I am a British citizen, but I've been in the United States for 25 years, and I'm a United States citizen, thankfully, for many, many years as well. The international nature of what we do is absolutely critical to the orchestra's local, national, international, and digital outreach. In a bit, you'll hear more about this evening's distinguished speakers, Ambassador Charles Rees, Adjunct Fellow at the RAND Corporation, and Ambassador Alexander Sandy Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and Eurasia Center, the Atlantic Council. We appreciate you, ambassadors, both being with us tonight, and I look forward to a thought-provoking discussion. This is a timely moment for us to engage meaningfully with the urgent political and diplomatic issues affecting our friends across the Atlantic and, by extension, each of us in a deeply global, interconnected world. The Philadelphia Orchestra has a rich history of international touring, having first performed outside of Philadelphia in the earliest days of its founding. In 1973, the orchestra with the legendary Eugene Ormandy was the first American orchestra to perform in the People's Republic of China, launching a fruitful cultural exchange that it's now in its fifth decade and fourth generation of participants, and includes multimedia partnerships with organizations such as the National Center for the Performing Arts in Beijing, the Shanghai Media Group, Shanghai Tech University, and the Shanghai Philharmonic, in an axis that goes largely from Beijing to Shanghai, but is also far deeper. That the origins of that tour were the result of a phone call between Ormandy and Nixon is testament to the role of government and the State Department in giving, if not support, but we're grateful for support, the moral impetus for many of these situations of cultural exchange. In the history of the orchestra, other international tours and residency activities have taken us to South America, the Middle East, where in 2018 the orchestra was the first major American symphony orchestra to tour Israel in 30 years. And more recently, we sent a delegation of musicians to the United Arab Emirates at the invitation of the US State Department. And throughout Asia, including sending a delegation of musicians to Mongolia in 2017, the first appearance by an American symphony orchestra in Mongolia. The Philadelphia Orchestra and music director Yannick Nézet-Séguin are now preparing to embark on a European tour this summer, our first visit to Europe since 2018, with performances taking place at renowned summer festivals in Scotland, the Edinburgh International Festival, stops in Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden, to Switzerland at the Lucerne Festival, France at the New Philharmonie de Paris, and Great Britain, Edinburgh and London at the end of the tour at the BBC Proms. And I'm thrilled that many of you in the audience will be joining us on that tour, and so happy to see many of you here today, and that we'll be together, traveling, many of us together, not for the first time. This is our first international tour since 2019. We were last overseas in Japan and Korea in 2019. This is an orchestra that every year is overseas. To not have been overseas is remarkable. I don't know if our conversation today will touch on this, but I don't hide my feelings about the role of the United Kingdom and Brexit. Touring Europe is more challenging than ever before because of Brexit, and it is has had a chilling effect on cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy between the United States and the UK and the rest of Europe. That we start our tour in Britain and ended in Britain while traveling through Europe has increased costs, caused an enormous amount of practical issues that we needed to overcome. This is even without the challenges of traveling during COVID, which is just a whole other layer of complications. So really, we are all in favor of deeper connections and deeper integration between countries. And on a further personal note, I'm especially looking forward to the orchestra's appearances at the BBC Proms at the Royal Albert Hall, which will conclude the European tour, which is where really I had my musical upbringing. And first heard the Philadelphia Orchestra there in, I think, 1981 or 1982. So it's especially moving to return to the Proms and to many of these iconic European festivals and concert halls with Yannick and the orchestra this time, performing masterworks alongside important premieres that show the scope and the diversity of international musical traditions as reflected by the Philadelphia Orchestra and our performances. When we travel, we aim wherever possible to engage in residency activities every place we visit, offering masterclasses, free public performances in addition to our main stage performances, panel discussions, and educational activities to local kids, music students generally. And these activities are central to our mission to bring the power of music to bear to communities outside the concert hall. We don't just want to arrive and leave. We want to leave lasting memories. And when I describe the four generations of people that we've touched in China, I'm now meeting grandkids of people who were at our original 1973 concerts who say that performance in 1973 is still part of my conversations with my grandparents. Last summer in 2021, we launched our Global Music Center with a pilot program in China. The Global Music Center is a new international music education program, digital for now, that provides high school and conservatory students with instrumental instruction, performance preparation, audition preparation, career guidance, and a curriculum that bridges, and this is crucial, different musical cultures through musical exchange and world-class musical instruction from musicians of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I'm so pleased that the Global Music Center will resume later this month with another collaboration with our artistic colleagues and students in China who meet at 9 o'clock in the morning in China and 9 o'clock in the evening here, all via Zoom. Thanks to our long history of travel and outreach, the Philadelphia Orchestra has maintained a close relationship with the US State Department and has been recognized as an important American cultural ambassador. The orchestra's international activities and the relationships we enjoy around the world also serve purpose close to home through outreach and partnerships with city and state organizations to foster business development for Greater Philadelphia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And there's nothing like a performance and a drink after a concert to catalyze those important business relationships, which we've been able to do globally with Lauren and her team and others around the city. So to this evening, hosted jointly by the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia Orchestra and Kimmel Center, Inc., we shine a light on the way that local partnerships can influence global connections and vice versa. And we look forward to tonight's discussion on the future of the European project. Let's remember that music and the arts have forged some of the deepest and most enduring cultural ties between the US and Europe throughout our shared history. In this sense, we are all ambassadors with an opportunity to build relationships and strengthen international bonds, even and especially in the face of division and discord. It's especially moving for me also to be part of this evening and to bring the orchestra to Europe, China, wherever it may be. We were just talking about having been in Pyongyang, North Korea. I took the New York Philharmonic. I was part of the team that took the New York Philharmonic, and I think we had a nice reception at your home when you were ambassador in Seoul there. But the power of that moment is something that has resonated deeply in the 15 years since. With that, our heartfelt thanks to the members of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, to our two ambassadors, Reese and Ambassador Vershbo, for being with us this evening. And now, Lauren, back to you to moderate this evening's discussion. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And now we'll dive into our discussion on the future of the European project. I'll give you a brief background on our two esteemed panelists tonight, and then we'll dive into the topic. Ambassador Alexander Vershbo, you're currently a distinguished fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Impressive credentials indeed. You served as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016. You also served as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and had a long career in the Foreign Service with 3 ambassador-level postings, once to NATO, once to the Russian Federation, and once to the Republic of Korea. Ambassador Charles Reese is here with us as well, an accomplished statesman and diplomat in his own right. Currently with the RAND Corporation as an adjunct fellow since 2020. You spent 8 years as the International Vice President at the RAND Corporation as well. Also, an impressive diplomatic career, very many posts to mention. I'll focus on Europe, serving as the U.S. Ambassador to Greece from 2004 to 2007, and 4 years prior to that, as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. You oversaw economic sections at the U.S. Embassy in London, as well as the U.S. mission to the European Union. You both have far too many awards and honors to mention, but I trust they were well deserved. Thank you both for joining us tonight. I'd like to start our discussion with framing, right, as we always do. The European Union was founded in the early 1950s as an economic tie to try and prevent another war on the continent, a World War III, to bring economies together to prevent going to war, an act of business diplomacy, perhaps. And that was 70 years ago. So many people are looking around and saying, well, it seems like it mostly worked, but there's need for reform within the European Union construct. I'd like to ask you both, do you agree with that? Is there a need for reform within the European Union? And if so, what would be your top recommendation to look towards reform for a strong European Union into the future?
It's on. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lauren, and thanks, Matthias, and all of you for having us here. I guess I would say with the European Union and the European construction, as the Europeans will talk about it, it's always in a period of evolution. In some ways, not dissimilar to our own country, which is also dealing with contemporary challenges all the time, although we don't change our constitution all that much. I think it's also useful to recall that the European Union itself and the European community before it there's a definite relationship to one of the more far-sighted American diplomatic initiatives of the last century, which was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine that preceded it, and the creation of NATO that followed shortly thereafter was part of an American conception for a Europe that was integrated, a Europe that didn't break down into competing national sovereignties in their economies and grew together. We incentivized European countries in getting Marshall Plan assistance to work together, first in the European coal and steel community and later on elsewise. We tolerated a certain amount of trade protectionism in the 50s as the basic agreement between France and Germany, in which the French opened up to German manufacturers and the Germans agreed to protect French agriculture, constituted the base for what was the European Community and later on became the European Union. The European Union has, and many Europeans will say this, has basically grown and developed through crisis. It has had crises and challenges all along. When I first started working on Europe in the 80s, the crisis was what was called Eurosclerosis. Europe was growing slowly. The European Union itself was unable to make decisions because of a rule of unanimity. and they couldn't find a solution to a problem that each one of the then 9 and shortly thereafter 10 member states would agree to. Jacques Delors, working with a very far-sighted Brit named Lord Cockfield, had a report and came up with a concept for which was called then EC 92, aimed at basically eliminating all the barriers to trade, the regulatory barriers to trade among the EU by 92. Successful? Yes, and in fact, in the end, also involved creation of the common currency. The last 20 years have been tough for the EU, nonetheless. Very successful, yes. Economically, the AC 92, the single market project, the single currency, all worked, but the EU has absorbed another 17 countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. It has been challenged by the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that led to the euro crisis, that led almost to collapse in the country I served in, Greece. It has dealt with the refugee crisis that came from the Syrian war that is part of the origins story of Brexit in complicated ways. And it has been dealing now with COVID. And COVID led in creation of a rescue plan. For the first time, the EU borrowed as 27, which it had never done before. And so the EU responds often getting things done when they need to. From the standpoint of transatlantic relations, and I'll stop with this, we were really impressed that the European Union stepped up immediately after the Russians invaded Ukraine and adopted a more far-reaching and tough series of sanctions than anyone had any right to expect. And individual member states have also responded with military assistance for Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Lauren, for the opportunity to participate in this joint venture between the World Affairs Council and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it's great to be on the stage again with my old friend and colleague, Charlie Reese. We served together or close by on many different occasions. And I'm also happy that this is the shortest commute I've ever had as a speaker, because I now live a block away at Symphony House, having moved here with my wife 3 years ago. The allure of grandchildren, who all ended up in Philadelphia for different reasons. But I'm here as the NATO hand on the panel. And I've always viewed the European project as not just about the EU, but also about NATO, the alliance, the transatlantic relationship writ large. And I think that it's fair to say that NATO was the security foundation of the whole process of European integration going back to the 50s. And working together, and there's sometimes been rivalry between NATO and the EU. There's sometimes been what one of my predecessors at NATO called the phenomenon of having two institutions in the same city but living on different planets, that they didn't communicate, they didn't work together. And I think that has been overcome, and we really need that kind of cooperation and joint action today. Because while there may be issues relating to the reform of the institutions, I think the most critical challenge right now, of course, is the fact that this wonderful process of knitting together the two halves of Europe at the end of the Cold War, which was a joint venture of the European Union and NATO, is now under severe threat from an aggressive Russia, with the ongoing war in Ukraine being a real test now of transatlantic cooperation and solidarity. So I think that what we need to see in the coming weeks and months is joining forces by NATO and the European Union to come up with a comprehensive strategy of containment. And we have to bring back old concepts of containment and deterrence. But given the stakes, We can't afford to squabble. We can't afford to have some of the theological debates that have raged sometimes between NATO-philes and Europhiles about strategic autonomy for the European Union, independence of decision-making vis-a-vis the United States. Today, the stakes are too high to have these kinds of disputes. We need to work together in the short term to help support Ukraine in every way, particularly in the military sphere, but also politically and economically, so that they can defeat the Russian aggression and create conditions in which they can negotiate a fair deal at the negotiating table. I think we've seen a lot of joining together by the EU and NATO and by the wider democratic community extending through the G7 to our traditional allies in the Asia-Pacific region. But Putin doesn't think he's losing, and we have to do more to turn the tide on the battlefield and at the same time ensure that Putin doesn't succeed, because if he succeeds in subjugating Ukraine, he's not going to stop with Ukraine. Other former Soviet republics and even members of NATO, such as the 3 Baltic states, could be in his crosshairs. So now's the time for the whole transatlantic community and the wider democratic world to unite and come up with the strategy and the staying power to ensure Ukraine doesn't cease to be a sovereign and independent state, and that Russia doesn't succeed in reestablishing a divided Europe, which we thought we had put behind us after 1989.
So when we look to integrating NATO and European Union and European forces to prevent the scenario you just laid out, who in Europe leads, right? With Angela Merkel stepping down, there's been a lot of sort of looking around, and Macron won the election, Boris Johnson survived, but who leads this alliance in order to make sure that we can knit those two together to prevent Russia's success or perceived success?
Well, we don't have a figure like Angela Merkel anymore, and of course that may not be totally a bad thing, because I think she's now admitting that she may have misread Vladimir Putin and overestimated the ability to kind of build bridges to Moscow through trade and closer economic integration. That was always criticized by other members of the European Union, particularly in the East. They're now in "I told you so" mode, and I think deservedly so. So there's no sort of single figure, but I think the whole community needs to work together. I think, fortunately, the Biden administration has shown the kind of traditional leadership that makes NATO work well and has been quite diligent in reaching out to the European Union, to the other G7 partners, and creating a truly global coalition to try to stop and reverse the Russian aggression. So we need to see that to continue. We'll see, perhaps President Macron may emerge, if he doesn't lose his parliamentary majority in the second round of the parliamentary elections there, can play sort of something of the role that Angela Merkel played, but he's unfortunately not fully trusted in the East. So it sometimes takes an external player like the United States to kind of bring together the different elements, different factions within the European Union. And so, unfortunately, I think we've had strong leadership from President Biden. I'm not without criticism of some aspects of what they've been doing. They've been a little bit slow in getting some of the essential weapons into the pipeline. But overall, I think they understand that Putin cannot succeed, or the whole world, as we've known it, will never be the same.
Ambassador Reese, I'd ask for an additional comment on that.
Well, yeah, no, I completely agree with Sandy. When you framed your question, I was going to answer the United States. I mean, in a sense, the transatlantic relationship, fundamentally the relationship between the United States and the European Union, is a complex one. And it responds, I think, very well to diplomacy. Unlike other parts of the world and other kinds of crisis, the European Union is a complex organization. I used to joke that we always knew that the European Union had taken a big step forward in terms of new competences, new things that they were going to do, because I had to put another chair on the European side of the table when we had an US-EU meeting. And so it's process-oriented, but that actually gives us a really good opportunity to work with them. They don't like to be dictated to. Europeans, like countries all over the world, don't like to be dictated to. But if you take the time, make the trips, hold the meetings, ask publicly for their input and advice, it's amazing how much support you can get and have gotten. And so I think the part of the approach that we have taken in this particular crisis, in the Ukraine crisis, but also in some of the other things, in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and the circumstances after 9/11, when we the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the major Secretary of the Treasury, other senators and congressmen actually show up and go to European meetings and listen, and are seen to listen and are seen to participate, we get outcomes that are far, far better than we even expected at the outset. And sometimes this isn't so visible on the outside because, you know, people are saying, well, why don't you just tell the Europeans what we need them to do? You know that with your own children, that often doesn't work. You have to take a little bit more subtle approach. And so I agree with Sandy. I think that in particular Tony Blinken, who himself is a fluent French speaker, has spent a lot of his career in and on Europe. That expertise has paid off in these particular very, very dicey circumstances we find ourselves.
It's heartening to hear that there's constructs and diplomacy and diplomatic channels that are working and can work here with Blinken, with Biden. At the same time, I'd like to ask you about the perception of the United States within Europe, with our own challenges that we have here, right? Of certainly gun violence, election challenges, how that pandemic was handled, our own migrant crisis at the border. The news is not good, right? And so while we may have these constructs and relationships that will strengthen where we need to strengthen now, does the perception of the US and the damage that's been done to that in the past few years challenge European leaders' ability to work well with the United States?
Well, I would say, and those of you who travel to Europe this fall will learn, Europeans are very worried about what's going on in the United States. They pay much more attention to our politics than we do to theirs. And that's true even though we of course only pay attention to 2 or 3 countries, the UK, Germany, France, maybe politically, and the others we... And for the time being, Ukraine, but not the politics of Ukraine, the circumstances of the war. But they will talk to you about the primaries, you know, and so they're very worried. And they obviously didn't take well to being hectored on their security spending and their support for NATO. And they're worried that the tensions that we have in our own economy and our own circumstances will bring that back in the normal cyclical change here. So I'm not Pollyanna about this, but all you can do is engage and recognize the remarkable progress that we've made recently and focus on keeping it going.
No, I agree with all of that. Just about any conversation with a visiting European eventually turns to, is Trump going to be back in 24? And it's everything, all the good things that we've been doing together under Biden and Blinken and the other members of the cabinet, is that all going to go up in smoke? And you can't give them a totally reassuring answer. They do follow our politics closely. They know that the polarization, which is a phenomenon across the world, but it's obviously especially severe in this country, could lead to a reverse for the Democrats in the midterms, but particularly it's up for grabs in 2024. And they know very well from all the dozens of books that have been written about the administration that President Trump came very close to pulling out of NATO at the 2018 NATO summit. And John Bolton predicted that that would be the first thing he would do if he ever got back into power. So my view is, we have to just kind of continue to plow ahead and try to solve the problems that we face. And so many of them depend on transatlantic cooperation, a joint approach, and hope that there's enough success that mainstream Republicans will kind of rise up against the more extreme wing of the party, whatever happens in the elections. But we're not supposed to be talking domestic politics in our diplomatic careers. We're a little more unshackled in retirement, but it is a real concern of our European allies and of people all around the world.
So those of you traveling to Europe this fall, you've got your work cut out for you to repair people-to-people relations and give some confidence that we'll be there with our European allies. So we can stay on unsteady relationships. We'll transfer back to Europe here. Let's talk a bit about Brexit. How damaging is Brexit to the perception of the strength of the European Union around the rest of the world? Perhaps China looking in and saying, wow, this alliance could break apart, or even Americans looking in and also wondering, how strong is the EU? How deep is the scar on Brexit, and what might be done to repair it?
I'll go first if you want, Sandy. I actually, at RAND, co-led 3 different books on Brexit. And I would say that the scars are less deep than you might expect on the European side. Britain is forever changed by Brexit. And for the worse, I'm with you. I mean, it was amazing to me to see the costs levied by Brexit on the British people. Britain's growth is now the slowest in the G7. The breakup of the United Kingdom is not beyond imagination, and the country is, once again lost an empire trying to find a role. It was one of the 3 leading countries in the EU, a grouping of 500 million people that had enormous influence, economically anyway, all over the world. It now is floundering around to try to live up to the promises of Brexit, but it's going to find that very difficult. I wrote a piece in the National Interest, and I can give you the citation if you want, that was based on a series of interviews that I did all over the rest of Europe about what would be the impact of Brexit. And I called it the long shadow of Brexit. The idea was to look out 10 years. How would the EU be different as a result of Brexit? And interestingly, there are changes. I mean, there are things that the British fought very hard, that without that fighting spirit of the British in Brussels may be more easy for the EU to do, but not many of those things have actually happened. The only one thing that you can point to is that with COVID, this decision I mentioned earlier that they would collectivize the full faith and credit of the member states to float some bonds, to raise some money, to do the anti-pandemic economic package. The British certainly would have opposed that. But many of the other things, the other impact of Britain in Brussels was a focus on getting things done. They're very pragmatic about how does this work, how does it get implemented, and they had a useful impact particularly on the French, which is, does it work in practice? It may work in practice, but does it work in theory? And the British were bringing things down and very much focused. Now, without Britain, the rest of the EU, there are many more kind of cross-country coalitions. The Frugal Five and the Club Med and the Eastern Europeans that kind of come together in Brussels to try and make legislation and make initiatives. And it may be somewhat easier for the EU to come up with a collective security system that makes sense because the British were always anxious about the impact on NATO. I think here we used to be very anxious, particularly those of us who are very concerned about NATO's future after the fall of the wall. We're concerned about competition between the EU and NATO, somehow diminishing NATO. We're less anxious about that. We now, with the situation in Ukraine, we recognize it's all hands on deck, and we need to strengthen the security posture in Europe however we can, and if a stronger European Union support for defense expenditures can do that, that's a good thing. So that's probably the only thing, and some of the fiscal stuff, the impact. The rest of the EU kind of continues on, evolves to deal with the circumstances of the day.
I don't have much to add, particularly if you wrote 3 books about it. But my impression is that it's been much more difficult for the UK than for the rest of the EU members, and I think the British consistently overestimated their leverage during the whole Brexit negotiation and how much the Europeans were desperate to keep them in. I think by the end it was so debilitating. They were just so ready to declare good riddance.
Yeah, and it was so messy that nobody else would consider doing this.
The fear of the dangerous example.
Yeah.
But as you said, now it's all hands on deck. And the UK, outside of the EU, is playing I think, an outsized role in the Ukraine effort in terms of providing weapons, providing training, clearly appreciated by President Zelensky as one of the strongest European voices in support of Ukraine right now. What I hope to see in the coming years after we get past the Ukraine crisis, if we ever do, is for the EU to try to kind of re-establish a more productive working relationship on security with the UK. The EU released a document a couple months ago called the Strategic Compass, which looked like one-upsmanship because NATO is working on something called the Strategic Concept, which is something NATO has been doing since the Cold War. But anyways, whether the name is silly or not, I think one of its weak points was that it didn't pay much attention to how to establish more robust and long-term security cooperation with the UK, which, after all, has the most powerful military forces among all the European countries. Not necessarily the biggest numbers. I think Germany has more people under arms, but not as defense-minded as the Brits. So bringing the EU and the UK closer together, at least in the security domain, seems worth the effort in my view.
Let's shift our gears into a place where Europe is perceived to be extremely strong in the world, and that is mitigation on climate change. Most of the world views Europe as being extremely progressive on fighting climate and seeing the concern around climate being incorporated into infrastructure, politics, local elections, and all different free trade agreements. Really everything they do, we perceive the EU to be working hard on climate change and setting standards that perhaps the rest of the world might need to adopt. Having worked in Europe and worked on regulatory frameworks and infrastructure and all of these things, I'd like to ask for your opinion. Is that true? Is Europe doing well on climate change, and are they united on it, or is it just a couple of leading countries that are doing well and the rest of Europe has a lot of work to do like the rest of the world?
That's not my area, so I'll let Charlie take that one on.
It's a mixed picture. Yes, they're doing better than pretty much any other country in the world. They are, of course, not a country, but they have a common environmental policy. they've done a number of innovative environmental policies, and they've done things that are sort of heavy-handed regulatory approaches as well. What they are and they have a carbon market, although it's not very effective in terms of reducing carbon, because countries, poorer countries, think of Poland that uses a lot of coal, but other countries in the south, in the EU, have lobbied, and because of the unusual and difficult decision-making processes, they have leverage that they're able to extract to get these policies to be not that binding. I think long range, what we seem to be trending towards is sort of a regional agreement approach to raising climate-related standards for products, if you think of manufacturers. So the EU is considering what they call CBAMs, which is a wonderful acronym. It stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Measures. And that what they would be supplemental tariffs on, think, steel that is made with a lot of coal and in a dirty fashion. If you could establish a standard for the way to produce steel, and then you levy an adjustment measure on imported steel that comes from places that don't adopt that. Now, I think that makes actually a lot of economic sense. But what it does, it seems to me, is it makes sense to make the area that raises those standards and imposes those kinds of adjustment measures as big as possible. And there are some in the United States who think, well, we ought to work with the Europeans on this. There is some discussion of supplemental tariffs on environmental grounds here. And of course, there's a lot of kind of reshoring and anti-globalization sentiment in this administration as well as in the last. But irrespective of that, if you're going to impose costs on domestic manufacturers, you ought to make sure that you adjust the imported costs, or you adjust so that the importers don't get a particular comparative advantage. And that would require working with the EU. The United States, there are a number of conversations that are going along. John Kerry, who is the leader of the climate change effort for the Biden administration, has been trying to incentivize or at least get something like this going. And the Europeans are very resistant. The Europeans would rather be sovereign or in control of their own circumstances than to join up with us, even though if the United States and maybe Canada and possibly even Japan agreed with the EU on the same standards and the same methodologies for determining the environmental impact of a product, it would be much more effective in climate terms. But they have their own pride of place, and part of that is by comparing themselves and their environmental record to everyone else, and everyone else can't be as good as they are, so they're a little skeptical. But I think it can be overcome. We'll see.
I'd like to see if anyone in the audience has questions for our panelists tonight. Maggie has a microphone, and there's a gentleman in the back on the left. Thank you.
Yes, I'd be very interested in having each of you comment as to how you think the war in Ukraine might end, and in particular, whether you would advise President Zelensky to accept a treaty that provides 20% of Ukraine becoming permanently part of Russia.
Well, there's a lot of different ways the conflict could end. On your specific question, I would not favor advising Zelensky, certainly not right now, that he should give up 20% or more of his territory, when I think there's still a chance that Ukraine can fight its way to a much stronger position at the bargaining table. I think it's most likely that the conflict will end with some kind of settlement or maybe just a elaborate ceasefire, which may or may not last for very long. It's not going to literally be won on the battlefield. But I think that right now we've seen the Russians perform in much more mediocre fashion than anyone would have predicted, particularly in the first phase of the war. They're doing a little better in the current campaign in Donbass, but that could be blunted if the U.S. speeds up some of its promised weapons deliveries to the Ukrainian armed forces. So the Ukrainians certainly have the will to fight. They're defending their homeland. They recognize that Putin has been quite explicit, particularly in recent days, on what he really wants. He really wants to resubordinate Ukraine to a kind of a new version of the Russian Empire. Putin does not accept Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign state, and he's working very hard to erase Ukraine's national identity, although that's going to be, I think, something he's not going to be able to succeed at as much as he dreams of that. But I think now we need to kind of be steady, not be swayed by prophets of doom, including venerated ones like Henry Kissinger, but continue to do what we've been doing since this war began, which is support the Ukrainians in their effort to win back their territory. As long as they're prepared to fight for it, we should do whatever we can to equip them to succeed and to inflict the defeat on the Russians, or strategic failure is what the administration sometimes calls it, to give them enough momentum that they can get a better outcome at the negotiating table or in some kind of prolonged ceasefire arrangement. In the meantime, we should also be showing the kind of the long-term nature of the commitment that we have to Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state by beginning to plan now for the gargantuan reconstruction effort that's going to be needed on the scale of the Marshall Plan. But we shouldn't wait till that ceasefire hopefully occurs, but begin the work now. And I think the European Union will play a kind of indispensable leading role working with the U.S. and other democratic nations. But we shouldn't wait on that. And at the same time, we need to kind of do what we've done ever since Ukraine became independent, is continue to counsel them on the necessary reforms, establishing the rule of law, fighting corruption, so that when they do emerge with their state intact, at least to some degree, they can overcome some of the problems of the past that have made them weak and vulnerable to Russian aggression. So they don't want to hear about reform, they never did, but we should begin that conversation as well. The most important thing is don't turn off the spigot of weapons and speed up the delivery of some of the critical artillery and multiple launch rocket systems that they've been promised but have not shown up in significant numbers.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think trying to pressure the Ukrainians to compromise with a country that is invaded tries to extinguish their reality as a sovereign state, whether it's 20% or 15%, doesn't make any sense. It may be, I agree with Sandy, it may be that the Ukrainians themselves and the Russians reach a point at which they want a ceasefire, an armistice, or something like that. As you know, in Korea, there was never a peace treaty, however many years back that was. I think I'm very much also interested in thinking about the challenges of reconstruction and helping Ukraine succeed after this is over. And you know, you didn't mention, you were polite enough not to mention it, but I was in charge of economic reconstruction in Iraq during the peak of the surge. Some commentary on this question of reconstruction of Iraq turns to how difficult it was for us to be successful in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's just a whole universe of difference between situation in Ukraine that Ukraine will face after the war and what we had in Iraq and Afghanistan in a different way. Iraq is not a country that is facing a civil war. Ukraine is not a country that is in a civil war or that has a significant domestic, insurgency or conflict. It is also a country in Europe with European institutions, imperfect certainly, but it is a country that is committed to its European vocation. And so the right model is the Marshall Plan, yes, but also our work with the countries of Central Europe after the fall of the wall, and our work in the Balkans after the Balkan Wars to try and help the sovereign states that succeeded Yugoslavia succeed. Those are the circumstances, and what we learned, particularly in the Balkans and Central Europe, was how important institutions are. The Ukrainians, since 2014, have made a great deal of effort to improve their institutions, and that's why they're doing as well as they're doing, but they have a lot more to do.
I would just add, I agree with that fully, and I think right now the EU is debating whether to give Ukraine official candidate status as a future member of the EU, even though it would take a decade and a half or longer for them to get through the gauntlet. But I think if they're going to be convinced that the West is still standing by them, as much as many European governments have enlargement fatigue, Ukraine is deserving of that. And I hope the EU decides in favor of candidate status, because it was, I think, the leverage, the incentive for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans to kind of make those painful reforms.
Absolutely.
Without that carrot at the end of the rainbow, we can't count on them doing the right thing when it comes to reform.
And it emphasizes the point of letting the EU take the lead. We should support the EU because the EU has that influence through the accession process and through the institutional processes that can make this succeed. If we try to Bigfoot them and try and determine how this is going to work, I think it will be far less successful.
I believe we had a question over here. The young lady in the white. Maggie will be with you in a moment. Thank you.
So I'm wondering, one of you spoke earlier about containment or deterrence. You did. What do you think that would look like? Would that be, as you're saying, bringing Ukraine into the EU? Would it be increasing NATO's influence in Eastern Europe? And will that kind of inflame Russian aggression, do you think? Or is that the steps we have to take to prevent Putin from invading other countries?
Well, so containment is a kind of comprehensive concept. We'll have many dimensions. Obviously, the military dimension is important, and I think we're going to see in the coming weeks some very significant decisions coming out of this NATO summit taking place at the end of this month in Madrid to reinforce significantly the conventional force posture along the Eastern Front, to put much more sizable forces there with additional capabilities so that the Russians don't think that they could grab some territory and then occupy it and force us to liberate our own territory from them. I think it also has a nuclear dimension. Biden administration is agonizing over the nuclear posture review that it owes the Congress now for almost a year. Whether we need to, particularly in light of the saber rattling by Putin during the Ukraine crisis, beef up our tactical nuclear weapons, have more capacity to deal with different kind of scenarios in which the Russians might actually use nuclear weapons, not so that we can have an exchange, but to deter them from thinking that they can use nuclear weapons to force us to capitulate in a conventional crisis. So there's lots of different military aspects of a more effective deterrence and containment strategy. And then I think we need to continue to look for other forms of pressure to isolate the Russians, to maintain the wall of sanctions that take time to take effect and are undermined a bit by the Europeans' continued dependence on Russian oil and gas. And the Russians are now making $1 billion a day under sanctions, and it's going to take time for the EU to deliver on the embargo that they've agreed to in principle. But we need to maintain economic pressure to show the Russians that they're going to be deprived of the influential role in the world that they hope to achieve through aggression. And at the same time as we do all these different things to keep the pressure on, we need to think of better ways to reach out to the next generation of Russians and make clear that this is not permanent confrontation that we seek. We seek to get back at least to some version of the path we were on after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Russia envisaged itself as part of a wider transatlantic community. Talk the talk on human rights and the rule of law. And I think that the spirit that we saw back in the 90s, as much as it doesn't appeal to Mr. Putin, is still there, and we have to think of some ways to make clear to the younger Russians that we still hope to reestablish a kind of partnership with Russia when it returns to the path of democracy, rule of law, respecting the UN Charter, not invading its neighbors, things like that. So that's not going to be easy, because Putin has been quite efficient in sealing off the country with this total propaganda in the state media, and that's gotten worse during this crisis. But we have to use social media, other new technologies. VPNs should be proliferated to Russians if they know how to use them, so that to get our message through that we aren't seeking a permanent confrontation, but we do stand by our principles and are not going to sweep these issues under the rug.
Maggie, I believe we have another question over here. Thank you.
Yeah, as reported in domestic press, the problem with the European Union is coming from Turkey because
A little closer to the mic.
It's problem with European Union mission for Ukraine is coming from Turkey because of the support for the Kurds. That's what's reported here anyway. I ask you a comment on two things. Number one, you talk about having standards for production of materials, which is great. But you've got a Supreme Court here who at this particular point doesn't think EPA has the right to regulate carbon. And that's only going to get worse. And there's a case pending at the court, which we'll get the review on. The last thing I'd like you to comment on is once Germany let Russia build the pipe to get fossil fuel to Germany, that to me, as an environmental attorney, was the end of really trying to get global warming under control. And as you pointed out, it was in the New York Times today, billions of dollars Russia's reaping from the delivery of fossil fuel.
A lot of questions there. I'm not sure I got all of them, but on the Turkey question relates to the current issue of Finland and Sweden. Oh, Turkey's EU admission. You can probably comment more on that.
No, Turkey can't block Ukraine's admission because Turkey's not a member of the EU. Turkey itself is an accession candidate from the 1980s, but it is not. It does not have the ability to veto. What it can veto is Sweden's accession to NATO. And Finland's. But they're upset about the Swedes, which have 100,000 Kurds resident in Sweden. And Jens Stoltenberg is trying to manage that particular case. But they can't have an effect on the succession candidacy. That's okay. No. Hey, listen, this is really messy stuff.
And Turkey is a difficult ally, but they are an ally, and NATO operates on the basis of consensus. I think when they abuse that consensus rule, it convinces Europeans that they should slow roll them on their aspirations to join the European Union. But the Turks, but I think it's going to be. They're going to find a solution. I think Stoltenberg is working the problem. The Finns have announced that they're going to change some legislation on the fight against terrorism, consistent with the fact that they're going to become a NATO member. they're not saying that they're soft on terrorism, but I think they'll do some necessary changes to convince the Turks that, that they hear them. But this is not a problem unique to Sweden and Finland, because we've had this long-running dispute with the Turks over our support for one of the Kurdish militias in Syria, which the Turks say is connected to the PKK terrorist group. And we've somehow managed to finesse that, but never fully solved it.
I'll just say very quickly on the environment stuff, because I know there are other questions, that you're right, of course, if the Supreme Court strikes down EPA's regulatory authority, that would be among many impacts of that. Such an action would be to further convince the Europeans that it's not worth watering down their own approach in order to do it joint with us. That said, if there's ever going to be progress on climate change, it will require participation of the United States economy, and the Europeans, if they focused on working together with us, they actually could help that take place. But the legislative way to make that happen is complex and will be for probably a future administration.
Maggie?
Would you guys comment on how much the European and American diplomatic community have been caught off guard by Putin's recklessness?
His recklessness?
Yes.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I would say the short answer is yes. I think there were different schools of thought as to how far he was going to go, but there was a sense that he was more likely, up until February 24th, he was more likely to launch a small incursion into Ukraine, try to expand the control over this Donbass region in the east, but not launch a full-scale invasion to topple the government and you know, conquer the country. But some of the intelligence reported, I don't see the intelligence anymore, pointed to the big invasion scenario. And this was a case where not only was Putin reckless, but he didn't even consult with a lot of his closest advisors, sprung the plan. I don't know who wrote the plan, probably the chief of their general staff, sprung the plan on his sort of inner circle, maybe to preserve the element of surprise, who knows, because he was a bit rattled by all the intelligence that the U.S. was revealing that kind of exposed some of his preparations. But yes, people judged that he wasn't going to behave as recklessly as he did, and he clearly made false assumptions about the Ukrainian people. He really did believe his own propaganda that they wanted to be liberated and they wanted to be made part of Russia again. He also thought that they were militarily incompetent because they weren't so effective 8 years earlier, but they made up for lost time and training and working with us, with other NATO allies, to raise the proficiency of their military. So Putin misjudged their will to fight, their capacity, and he also misjudged the West. I think he thought that we would be divided, that we wouldn't deliver on the strong sanctions that we were threatening before the war, and that the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan showed that we were kind of easily rattled. And the fact that the opposite has come true. You know, NATO is growing more present on its borders, not less, and the Russian economy is facing the toughest sanctions it's ever confronted. All those things were miscalculations by Putin, which contributed to his reckless behavior.
I would only add that it's been impressive to see the way Sandy's successor, Bill Burns, Sandy's successor as ambassador in Moscow, Bill Burns, now head of the CIA, has, working with the Director of National Intelligence, has completely transformed the way that our intelligence has found its way to the public. in this particular conflict, I think, very, very usefully. And it made it, I think, easier to put together that international coalition that we've been talking about. And it's true, almost anything that happens in the broader global arena is often is not always accurately predicted. But even if we were pretty good but not perfect, we were a hell of a lot better than Putin. As Sandy points out, Putin has many, many times more serious miscalculations of the reaction that he would face for his actions.
Got time for one more question in the audience? All right, Maggie's coming with the microphone, sir.
How do we reconcile NATO's eastern expansion with the Monroe Doctrine? And my second question is, if it's necessary to resort to NATO military intervention, would we do so to inflict a defeat on Putin or to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty?
Those are two very large questions. For
I'll start with the more specific one, the second one. Given the position repeatedly enunciated by President Biden and his administration, that we're not going to get into direct combat with Russia because of our concern, understandably, to avoid escalation and possibly even nuclear escalation. I don't see that changing. So we'll continue to do, hopefully, enough to equip the Ukrainians to fight their own battles. And they're not asking for American boots on the ground, asking us to fight for them. They're just asking us to give them more of the material that they need to have a decent chance on the battlefield. So I think we owe it to them to do that. On your first question, I haven't thought about it in terms of the Monroe Doctrine. I think the whole thing that is sometimes misunderstood about NATO enlargement, that it was demand-driven. We weren't out there recruiting new members, trying to expand the footprint of the NATO alliance. We were responding to the newly independent countries, or newly free countries of Central and Eastern Europe, their desire to follow in the footsteps of Western Europe and to be part of a larger collective security system. And I think it was the right decision to do, to kind of undo some of the errors made at the end of World War II at the Yalta Summit, and basically consigning half of Europe to Soviet domination. But I think it's also important to remember that when we started this process of opening NATO's door to the admission of new members, we also reached out to Russia to establish a strategic partnership. We signed agreements. We gave them security assurances that we wouldn't put significant conventional forces on the territory of the new members, that we would not put any nuclear weapons on the territory of new members. We created a whole structure of councils and committees to work together on security problems, and a lot of that actually bore fruit. We had Russian troops under NATO command in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. We worked together on counterterrorism after 9/11. We even were discussing how to link our missile defense systems to deal with ballistic missile threats from countries like Iran and Syria. That unfortunately didn't pan out. I think Putin has used NATO more as a kind of a whipping boy than as something that he really sees as a security threat to Russia. In fact, if you look at Russia's military forces, they actually continue to go down in the years in the 90s and the first part of this century when NATO was taking in new members. So it was never, I think, a genuine military threat in the Russians' eyes, but they've now used it as the bogeyman for propaganda reasons.
All right. With that, I thank our guests for their insightful comments and sharing their perspectives with us tonight. Thank you to our partners at the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Kimmel Cultural Campus for hosting us tonight. It's been a pleasure to mix our members for a wonderful conversation. For those of you traveling to Europe soon, and there are many in the audience, good luck. We'll be thinking of you. And we look forward to seeing you all at a World Affairs Council program and back at the orchestra many times again in the future. Thank you for your time and attention tonight. Bon voyage, and have a good evening. Thank you.